October 1907. Sheriff Thomas Brennan wasn't looking for a crime. He was looking for a runaway girl. But when 17-year-old Ruth Dalton stumbled into his office in Pikeville, Kentucky, barefoot and shaking, the first words out of her mouth changed everything. "Grandma's in the cellar, in jars. We eat her on Sundays." 23 people, 4 generations, and a family compound where no one had been buried in 40 years. Because the patriarch, Silas Dalton, believed that God had commanded the faithful to remain within the family body until Christ's return. The dead weren't mourned and laid to rest. They were butchered, preserved, and consumed in ritualistic meals that blurred the line between communion and horror. Before we descend into that cellar and open those jars, subscribe to Stand With Us as we uncover the stories history tried to bury, and comment your city so we know where these dark truths are reaching across the world. How does a family convince itself that eating the dead is an act of faith? And what happens when children are raised to believe that cannibalism is Christianity? The Dalton family wasn't always a house of cannibals. In 1867, they were ordinary Appalachian homesteaders. Silas Dalton, his wife Naomi, and their growing brood of children scratching out a living in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. They lived in a region so remote that the nearest church was a 2-day walk, and the nearest town, Pikeville, might as well have been on another continent. But by 1907, the family had become something else entirely. Something that Kentucky State Police would later describe in sealed case files as a conspiracy of theological delusion extending across 4 generations. 23 people lived on the compound, Silas and Naomi's surviving children, their grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, and not one of them questioned the practice that had defined their family for 4 decades. What transformed ordinary mountain people into ritual cannibals? The answer begins 2 generations earlier, with a man who believed he'd discovered a secret hidden in Scripture. The patriarch was Elkanah Dalton, Silas's father, who arrived in eastern Kentucky in 1843 as a traveling preacher. Elkanah wasn't educated in any formal sense, but he was literate, obsessive, and convinced that mainstream Christianity had corrupted Christ's true message about resurrection and the body. He kept journals, dozens of them filled with marginalia, biblical cross-references, and increasingly bizarre theological calculations. Elkanah believed that the phrase, "This is my body, given for you," from the Last Supper, wasn't metaphorical. He thought Christ had literally commanded his followers to consume the faithful dead, preserving their flesh within the community until the second coming, when all would be resurrected together as one unified body. Where did this obsession come from? Elkanah had been a circuit preacher in Tennessee during the Second Great Awakening, a period of religious fervor that produced dozens of fringe movements. He'd encountered a group called the Flesh Preservationists, a short-lived sect that practiced mummification of deceased members, believing physical preservation was necessary for bodily resurrection. Elkanah took the concept further. Why preserve bodies externally when you could preserve them internally, within the living bodies of the faithful? His sermons grew stranger. He began teaching that families who buried their dead were casting out the faithful, denying them participation in the resurrection community. The few neighbors who heard these teachings dismissed Elkanah as eccentric but harmless. They didn't know he was documenting everything, building a theological framework that would outlive him by decades. Elkanah's son, Silas Dalton, didn't just believe his father's teachings, he was the first to put them into practice. After Elkanah died in 1867, Silas inherited not only the family homestead, but also his father's journals and his obsession. Where Elkanah had theorized, Silas acted. Silas had watched his father die of pneumonia, a slow, suffocating death that took 3 weeks. On his deathbed, Elkanah made Silas swear an oath. "Don't bury me. Keep me with you. Keep the family whole until Christ returns." Silas, 24 years old and desperate to honor his father's final wish, made a decision that would define 4 generations. He didn't bury Elkanah. Instead, he butchered the body, carefully, methodically, following instructions his father had written in the final journal. The flesh was cut into portions, salted, and preserved in ceramic jars. Over the following months, Silas and his wife Naomi consumed Elkanah in ritualistic meals. Silas read from his father's journals during these meals, framing each consumption as a preservation communion, a way of keeping Elkanah's body alive within the family until the resurrection. Naomi resisted at first. She wept. She refused. But Silas was persuasive, and in the isolation of the mountains there was no one to contradict his theology. Eventually, Naomi capitulated, and once she'd participated, once she'd crossed that line, there was no turning back. In 1872, Silas and Naomi's firstborn son Caleb died at age 4 from scarlet fever. The death devastated them both, but Silas saw it as confirmation. God was testing the family's faith. Would they bury Caleb and cast him out, or would they preserve him within the family body as Elkanah had commanded? Silas chose preservation. He butchered his own son's body and stored it in jars. For Naomi, this was the breaking point. She became catatonic for weeks, barely speaking, moving through the cabin like a ghost. But when she finally emerged from her grief, she had accepted Silas's theology entirely. She began to see the practice not as horror, but as an act of love, a way to keep Caleb with them forever. The death of the first child crystallized the family's practice. From that point forward, every death in the Dalton family followed the same pattern. No burial, only preservation and consumption. The ritual became normalized, passed down to the next generation as the way we honor the dead. By 1907, the Dalton family had been practicing ritual cannibalism for 40 years, and not one of the children born into the compound in the later generations ever questioned it. Why didn't anyone intervene? Because intervention required knowledge, and knowledge didn't reach the Dalton compound. The family lived in a hollow 15 miles from Pikeville, accessible only by a narrow footpath that became impassable in winter. They didn't attend church. They didn't trade in town regularly. They were self-sufficient, growing their own food, raising livestock, and interacting with the outside world only when absolutely necessary. In those mountains, isolation wasn't just geographic. It was cultural. Families kept to themselves. What happened on your land was your business, and anyone who pried risked violence or ostracism. The Daltons weren't just protected by distance. They were protected by a code that valued privacy above all else. And in that isolation, Silas Dalton's theology grew unchecked, metastasizing across 4 generations until 23 people believed that eating their dead was the holiest act they could perform. Marcus Webb was a dry goods peddler who made circuits through eastern Kentucky 3 times a year, selling flour, salt, fabric, and preserved goods to families too remote for stores. In the summer of 1899, he made his first visit to the Dalton compound. Silas bought heavy salt, 50 pounds of it, an unusual amount even for a large family preparing for winter. Webb noted it but thought nothing of it. Mountain families preserved everything. Meat spoiled quickly in the heat. On his second visit in the fall of 1900, Webb noticed something odd. The Daltons had a smokehouse, but it wasn't being used. When he asked Silas about it, Silas said, "We prefer other methods of preservation." Webb saw ceramic jars stacked inside the cabin, dozens of them sealed with wax. "Family recipes," Silas said, smiling, "passed down from my father." On his third visit in the spring of 1902, Webb saw a girl, maybe 8 years old, carrying a jar from the cellar. She stumbled and the jar shattered on the stone steps. What spilled out didn't look like pickled vegetables or preserved fruit. It looked like meat, dark, salted, cut into uniform chunks. The girl began to cry, not because she was hurt, but because she'd wasted grandfather. Webb stared. The girl scooped the meat back into a cloth, her hands shaking. Silas appeared and ushered the girl inside, then turned to Webb. "Accidents happen, Mr. Webb. We'll be more careful." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes held a warning. Webb left. He didn't return to the Dalton compound for 3 years. By 1905, Webb's unease had faded into the background noise of mountain life. He resumed his circuit, and in the fall of that year, he visited the Daltons again. This time he noticed the family had grown. There were more children, 9 by his count, and a strange uniformity to their behavior. They didn't play. They didn't laugh. They moved through chores with mechanical precision like soldiers in a barracks. Webb also noticed the smell. Not rot exactly, but salt and smoke and something metallic. It clung to the compound, settling into the wood and soil. When Webb asked about it, Silas said, "We've been curing hams." But there were no pigs on the property, no livestock beyond a few chickens. On his fifth visit in 1907, Webb saw something he couldn't explain away. He arrived at dawn earlier than usual and found the family gathered in a circle outside the main cabin. Silas stood at the center holding a jar. He opened it, removed a piece of preserved meat and placed it on a wooden platter. The family bowed their heads. Silas spoke. "We remember Caleb, who remains with us. His body sustains ours until the resurrection." Each family member took a piece of the meat and ate it in silence. The children didn't flinch. The adults' faces were serene. This wasn't desperation or starvation. This was ritual. Webb left without selling anything. 2 weeks later, he was drinking in a tavern in Pikeville, and he told another peddler, "There's something wrong with the Dalton family. I don't know what it is, but it ain't natural." In 1903, a midwife named Catherine Lowell was called to the Dalton compound to assist with a difficult childbirth. Naomi's daughter Abigail was in labor with her third child. Catherine arrived and found the family gathered in the main cabin waiting. The birth went smoothly, and Catherine stayed overnight to monitor mother and baby. That night, she heard something, a low, rhythmic chanting from the cellar below. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was liturgical, like a prayer or a hymn. In the morning, she asked Naomi about it. "Family devotions," Naomi said. "We keep our own hours with God." Catherine noticed the jars. Dozens of them stacked on shelves lining the cellar walls. Each jar was labeled with a name and a date. Elkanah, 1867. Caleb, 1872. Miriam, 1889. Catherine asked what they were. "Family preserves," Naomi said. "Recipes passed down." But the jars were too uniform, too carefully labeled, and the dates weren't harvest dates, they were death dates. Catherine had delivered enough babies in mountain families to recognize memorials, but these weren't grave markers. They were storage. Catherine left the next morning and never returned to the Dalton compound. But she told other midwives what she'd seen, and the story spread in whispers. By the early 1900s, families in the surrounding region traded stories about the Daltons who don't bury their dead. Rumors circulated. The family kept bodies in the cellar, practiced strange rituals, ate meals that smelled like a slaughterhouse. But rumors were all they remained. No one filed a report with law enforcement. No one demanded an investigation. Why? Because in post-Civil War Appalachia, survival depended on silence. Families who talked to authorities were families who got burned out or shot. The code was ironclad. Mind your own kin and expect others to mind theirs. If the Daltons wanted to keep jars in their cellar and chant at midnight, that was their business. The isolation that had protected the Daltons from scrutiny for 40 years would protect them until a single act of courage shattered the silence. In 1906, a county census taker named Daniel Frost was assigned to document families in the remote hollows outside Pikeville. He reached the Dalton compound in late summer and found the family uncooperative. Silas refused to provide names or ages for all the children, saying, "The government's got no business in family matters." Frost noted that the children looked malnourished, thin, pale, with hollow eyes. He asked if the family needed assistance. Silas said, "We provide for our own, always have." Frost tried to press further, asking to speak to the children privately. Silas stepped in front of him. "You're done here, Mr. Frost." Frost left and filed a report with the county clerk, recommending a welfare check. The request was denied. The county had neither the manpower nor the legal authority to force their way onto private property without evidence of a crime. Frost's report was filed and forgotten. But Frost couldn't forget. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "There's something deeply wrong with the Dalton family. The children don't behave like children, they behave like prisoners who've forgotten their captive." 1 year later, the truth would emerge. Not from an investigation, but from a girl who refused to stay captive any longer. Elkanah Dalton was 64 years old when he died in 1867. He was a circuit preacher, a father of 3, and the architect of a theology that would consume his descendants for 4 decades. His death was ordinary, pneumonia, common in the mountains, but what happened after was anything but. Elkanah's final wish was clear. "Don't bury me. Keep me with you." Silas honored that wish by butchering his father's body and preserving it in jars. Over the following months, Silas and Naomi consumed Elkanah in ritualistic meals, each bite framed as an act of theological obedience. Elkanah never knew his theology would extend beyond his own body. He never knew his grandson's corpse would be the second to be preserved, or that his great-grandchildren would grow up eating the dead as casually as eating bread. His obsession with resurrection and bodily preservation planted a seed that would grow into a forest of horror. Caleb Dalton was 4 years old when scarlet fever took him in 1872. He was Silas and Naomi's firstborn, a boy with blonde hair and a bright laugh that echoed through the hollow. His death shattered his parents, but it also crystallized their faith in Silas's theology. Silas butchered Caleb's body with the same methodical care he'd used for Elkanah. The flesh was cut, salted, and stored. Naomi wept through every meal, but she participated. And as the months passed, she began to believe that Caleb was still with them, not in memory, but in substance. His body sustained theirs. He was part of them. The other children born after Caleb's death were raised with his story as a foundational myth. They were taught that Caleb hadn't died. He'd been transformed, preserved, made eternal within the family body. By the time Ruth Dalton was born in 1890, Caleb's story wasn't tragic. It was aspirational. Miriam Dalton was Silas and Naomi's third child, born in 1875. She was intelligent, curious, and the first family member to openly question the practice. At age 14 in 1889, Miriam asked her father why they didn't bury the dead like other families. Silas responded with scripture and theology, but Miriam wasn't convinced. She began refusing to participate in the preservation communion meals. She said it felt wrong, that God wouldn't ask families to eat their own. Silas saw her resistance as a spiritual crisis and isolated her, confining her to the cellar for days at a time to pray and reflect. Naomi pleaded with Miriam to submit, to accept the family's covenant. Miriam tried to run. She made it 3 miles down the mountain before Silas caught her. When he brought her back, he told the family that Miriam had been tested by doubt and had failed. 2 weeks later, Miriam died. The family said it was fever, but there were whispers, even within the compound, that Silas had poisoned her. Miriam's body was butchered and preserved like the others, and her death sent a message to the rest of the family. Resistance was not only futile, it was fatal. By 1890, the Dalton compound housed 3 generations. Silas and Naomi's surviving children, Abigail, Josiah, and Deborah, had married within the family or brought in spouses from nearby isolated families. They had children of their own, and those children were raised with the preservation communion as a normal part of life. Ruth Dalton, born in 1890, was one of these children. She never knew a world where the dead were buried. She was taught that the jars in the cellar contained the bodies of her ancestors, preserved until Christ's return. She was taught that eating from those jars was an act of love, a way to honor the dead and keep the family whole. But Ruth was different. She noticed things the other children didn't. She saw that the adults' eyes held something, guilt maybe, or grief buried under layers of theological justification. She noticed that the younger children who asked too many questions were isolated, disciplined, silenced. And she noticed that no one ever left the compound, not permanently. The family was a closed system, feeding on itself in more ways than one. By the time Ruth turned 17, she had made a decision. She would be the first to break free. Elkanah, Caleb, Miriam, and the dozen others whose bodies filled the jars weren't missing persons. They had died on the compound, among family, and their deaths were attributed to illness, accident, or natural causes. There were no outsiders demanding answers, no extended relatives filing missing person reports. The isolation that enabled the practice also concealed it. Deaths in remote mountain communities were common and often went unrecorded. A 4-year-old dying of scarlet fever wasn't unusual. A teenage girl dying of fever after being confined to a cellar raised no alarms, because no one outside the family knew she'd been confined. The victims weren't abducted strangers. They were family members whose deaths were mourned, in their own way, and whose bodies were consumed in rituals framed as sacred. And because the practice was internal, self-contained, it remained invisible to the outside world for 40 years. We know about Elkanah because Silas kept his father's journals, documenting every step of the first preservation. We know about Caleb because Naomi mentioned him in letters to a distant cousin, describing how the family kept him close after his death. We know about Miriam because a midwife heard the family discussing her death and noted it in her personal diary. And we know about all of them because Ruth Dalton remembered. She remembered the names on the jars, the dates, the stories told at meals. When she escaped in October 1907, she carried those memories with her, memories that would become testimony, evidence, and proof of 40 years of horror hidden in the mountains. Sheriff Thomas Brennan was 42 years old in 1907. A former coal miner who'd taken the sheriff's job in Pikeville after a mining accident left him with a limp and a need for steadier work. He was practical, skeptical, and uninterested in mountain gossip. When Ruth Dalton appeared in his office on October 14, 1907, he assumed she was a runaway, common enough in families where marriages were arranged and girls had little say in their futures. But Ruth wasn't running from an arranged marriage. She was running from something Brennan had never encountered. She spoke calmly, methodically, describing a family that didn't bury its dead, that kept bodies in jars, that ate the preserved flesh in ritualistic meals. Brennan's first instinct was disbelief. "You're saying your family eats people?" Ruth corrected him. "We eat family. There's a difference. We're keeping them alive until Jesus comes back." Brennan called in Dr. Harold Winters, the county physician, to examine Ruth. Winters found her malnourished but otherwise healthy. More importantly, he believed her. "Sheriff," Winters said, "this girl's not confused or delusional. She's describing something she's lived with her entire life. Something real." Brennan faced a dilemma. If Ruth's story was true, he was looking at the most disturbing case in Kentucky's history. But if it was false, if Ruth was mentally unstable or fabricating, then he'd be violating the Dalton family's rights by raiding their property. He needed more evidence. Brennan sent 2 deputies to the Dalton compound under the pretense of a routine welfare check. They arrived on October 17th and found Silas cooperative but cold. He denied Ruth had ever lived there. "No girl by that name in this family," he said. When the deputies asked to see the cellar, Silas refused. "Private property. You got a warrant?" They didn't. But one deputy noticed the smell. Salt, smoke, and something metallic that clung to the compound like a fog. He also noticed the children. There were 8 of them ranging from ages 4 to 16, and not one made eye contact. They moved in silence, performing chores with mechanical precision. The deputies left without evidence but with mounting suspicion. One deputy told Brennan, "Something's very wrong there, Tom. Those kids look scared. And the smell. I've been in slaughterhouses. It smelled like that." Brennan interviewed Marcus Webb, the traveling peddler, who corroborated Ruth's description of the jars and the strange rituals. He interviewed Catherine Lowell, the midwife, who described the labeled jars and the chanting from the cellar. Each piece of testimony added weight to Ruth's claims, but none of it constituted proof of a crime. Brennan spent 2 weeks gathering evidence. He reviewed county records and found that the Dalton family hadn't registered a death in over 30 years, despite having 3 generations living on the compound. He interviewed neighboring families who confirmed that the Daltons never held funerals, never visited cemeteries, never asked for help burying the dead. He also consulted with a prosecutor in Frankfort, the state capital, who advised caution. "Cannibalism isn't explicitly illegal in Kentucky," the prosecutor said. "Desecration of corpses is, but you'll need physical evidence. Bodies remain something tangible. Testimony alone won't be enough for a conviction." Brennan knew what he had to do: raid the compound, search the cellar, and find the jars. But he also knew that if Ruth was wrong, if the jars contained pickled vegetables or preserved pork, then he'd destroy his career and the family's reputation. On October 28, 1907, Brennan made his decision. He secured a search warrant from a county judge, citing credible testimony of unlawful desecration of human remains. He assembled a team of 6 deputies, Dr. Winters, and a county clerk to document evidence. They would raid the Dalton compound at dawn. The night before the raid, Brennan sat with Ruth in a safe house and asked her one final question. "Are you absolutely certain about what you saw in those jars?" Ruth didn't hesitate. "Sheriff, I've eaten from those jars since I was 5 years old. I know what's in them." Brennan asked her to describe the cellar layout. Ruth drew a map from memory, marking the location of the jars, the stairs, the trapdoor leading to the main cabin. She listed the names on the jars: Elkanah, Caleb, Miriam, Josiah Sr., Deborah's firstborn, and others. 14 in total. If you're right, Brennan said, we're going to find bodies. If you're wrong, I lose everything. Ruth looked at him with eyes older than her 17 years. I'm not wrong, Sheriff. And those people downstairs, my brothers, my sisters, my cousins, they need someone to save them before they end up in jars too. At 5 a.m. on October 29, 1907, Brennan and his team departed for the Dalton compound, carrying rifles, lanterns, and the growing certainty that they were about to open a door to something that shouldn't exist. Ruth Dalton's escape began 3 nights before she arrived at Sheriff Brennan's office. On the evening of October 11, 1907, the family gathered for a preservation communion meal. Silas opened a jar labeled Josiah Sr., 1902, and portioned out the preserved flesh. Ruth, seated at the table with 12 other family members, felt something inside her break. Not her fear, but her tolerance for pretending this was normal. She had been planning her escape for months, hiding food in her bedroll, noting the patrol patterns of the adults, memorizing the footpaths through the forest. That night, after the meal, she waited until the compound fell silent. Then she slipped out through a window in the sleeping quarters, squeezed through a gap in the fence, and ran. She ran barefoot through 15 miles of forest in the dark. She fell twice, cutting her feet on rocks and roots. She heard her father's voice calling after her, "Ruth, you come back, you're breaking the covenant." But she didn't stop. She ran until dawn, when she stumbled onto the main road leading to Pikeville. A farmer found her collapsed by the roadside and brought her to town. Ruth's first words to him were, "I need the sheriff. My family eats the dead." Over the following 3 days, Ruth gave testimony that filled 18 pages of handwritten notes. She described the theology Silas taught, that the faithful must remain within the family body until Christ returns, that burial was a sin of separation, that consumption was an act of love and preservation. She described the rituals, the Sunday meals where jars were opened, the prayers recited over the preserved flesh, the children taught to see this as communion. She named the dead whose bodies filled the jars, providing dates of death and descriptions of how each body had been prepared. But the detail that convinced Brennan she was telling the truth was this. Ruth described the tools used for butchering, the ceramic jars imported from a supplier in Lexington, and the cellar's hidden trap door that could only be accessed by removing a section of the kitchen floor. These weren't details a confused or fabricating girl could invent. By October 28th, Brennan had everything he needed: Ruth's testimony, corroborating witness statements, and a search warrant. He briefed his team on what to expect. A family that believed they were following God's commands, a cellar filled with human remains, and the possibility of violent resistance. These people aren't criminals in their own eyes, Brennan said. They're faithful, and faithful people don't surrender their faith without a fight. At dawn on October 29, 1907, the team approached the Dalton compound. Sheriff Brennan and his team surrounded the Dalton compound at sunrise. Silas Dalton emerged from the main cabin, unhurried as if he'd been expecting them. He didn't look afraid. He looked serene. "Sheriff Brennan," Silas said, "you're trespassing." Brennan held up the warrant. "We have legal authority to search this property for evidence of unlawful desecration of human remains." Silas smiled, thin, humorless. "You don't understand what you're about to see. You'll think it's evil, but it's obedience." Brennan ignored him and ordered deputies to search the compound. They began with the main cabin. Inside, they found the trap door Ruth had described, hidden beneath a section of the kitchen floor. 2 deputies pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Dr. Winters was the first to enter the cellar carrying a lantern. What he found stopped him mid-step. The cellar walls were lined with shelves. On those shelves sat dozens of ceramic jars, each sealed with wax, each labeled with a name and date. Elkanah, 1867. Caleb, 1872. Miriam, 1889. The jars were uniform, methodically organized, and filled with preserved human flesh. Winters opened one jar. The smell hit him immediately. Salt, decay, and something unmistakably human. He staggered back, retching. "It's real," he gasped. "God help us. It's all real." Brennan confronted Silas outside the cabin. "What's in those jars, mister?" "Dalton?" Silas didn't flinch. Family, the faithful, we keep them with us until Christ returns. You butchered them. We preserved them. Silas corrected. We honored them. You bury your dead and leave them to rot in the ground. We keep ours close. We sustain ourselves with their bodies, and when the resurrection comes, we'll all rise together, unified, whole. Brennan asked, and the children? Do they know what they're eating? They know they're eating family. They know it's sacred. One of the deputies dragged 8 children out of the sleeping quarters. The youngest was 4, the oldest 16. None of them resisted. None of them cried. They stood in a line, silent, staring at nothing. Behind the main cabin, deputies found a second burial site. Not jars, but shallow graves marked with wooden crosses. Dr. Winters exhumed 3 graves and found skeletal remains consistent with children aged between 2 and 6. These weren't preserved. They'd been buried. When Brennan asked Silas about them, Silas said, "Infants, too young to participate in the communion. We returned them to the earth." The distinction was chilling. Children old enough to eat the dead were preserved when they died. Infants were buried. The family had created a theological hierarchy even within death. By midday on October 29th, 23 people had been removed from the compound. Silas and Naomi, their adult children, and 12 children ranging from ages 4 to 16. 14 jars of human remains were documented and collected as evidence. The Dalton family's 40-year practice of ritual cannibalism had ended. Inside Silas's cabin, investigators found Elkanah Dalton's journals, 8 leather-bound volumes spanning from 1840 to 1867. The early entries were theological musings, biblical exegesis, and reflections on resurrection theology. But the final entries, written in the weeks before Elkanah's death, were explicit instructions. One passage read, "The body is not a shell to be discarded. It is the vessel of the soul, and when the faithful die, their bodies must remain within the community of believers. Burial is separation. Consumption is unity. Let my body nourish my son's body, and his body nourish his children's, until we stand together before Christ, indivisible." Elkanah had included detailed instructions: how to butcher the body, how to preserve the flesh, how to conduct the rituals. Silas had followed those instructions to the letter. Silas kept his own journals, documenting every death and every preservation from 1867 to 1907. The entries were clinical, methodical, devoid of emotion. Caleb died February 12, 1872, preserved February 14th. First Communion held February 19th. Family unified. Another. Miriam died November 3, 1889, preserved November 5th. Resistance noted. Communion delayed until November 10th. The journals provided a complete record. 14 family members had died and been preserved over 40 years. The practice had continued uninterrupted, passed down through 3 generations, normalized to the point where children born into the family saw it as ordinary. Using Silas's journals and Ruth's testimony, authorities identified all 14 victims by name. The jars were photographed, cataloged, and eventually given to the state medical examiner for analysis. Forensic examination confirmed the remains were human, preserved with salt and stored in airtight containers. For the families of those who had married into the Dalton clan and then vanished, the journals provided horrifying closure. One woman, who had sent her daughter to marry Silas's son in 1895, learned her daughter had died in childbirth in 1898, and her body had been consumed by the family over the following year. The trial of Silas Dalton and his adult children began in December 1907 in Pike County, Kentucky. It lasted 5 weeks and drew national attention. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Cannibal Family Exposed in Appalachia," and 40 Years of Horror Hidden in Kentucky Mountains. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney James Holbrook, presented overwhelming evidence. Ruth's testimony, the jars of human remains, Silas's journals, and expert testimony from Dr. Winters. The defense argued that the family had been practicing religious freedom, and that desecration of corpses required intent to harm or disrespect, neither of which applied to the Daltons, who believed they were honoring the dead. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. On January 15, 1908, they returned a verdict: guilty on all counts of desecration of human remains. Silas received a sentence of 20 years in prison. His adult children received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years. Naomi, deemed mentally incapacitated by prolonged psychological trauma, was committed to a state psychiatric facility. Silas never recanted. In a letter written from prison in 1910, he wrote, "I have no regrets. I obeyed my father, and I obeyed God. The world calls it evil because the world doesn't understand resurrection. One day when Christ returns, they'll see. We'll all rise together, whole, unified, and I'll be vindicated." Silas Dalton died in prison in 1921 at age 78. The 12 children removed from the compound ranged in age from 4 to 16. All were placed in state custody and evaluated by physicians and psychologists. Medical examinations revealed chronic malnutrition, untreated illnesses, and signs of prolonged psychological conditioning. The younger children, aged 4 to 8, had no frame of reference for normal life. They believed the rituals they'd participated in were Christianity. They asked social workers when the next communion would be held. They were confused when told that families don't eat their dead. The older children, aged 9 to 16, understood that what they'd experienced wasn't normal, but they'd been too afraid or too conditioned to resist. One boy, aged 14, told a social worker, "I knew it was wrong, but if you say it's wrong, you end up in the cellar, or in a jar." Ruth Dalton, whose escape had triggered the raid, was placed with a distant relative in Lexington. She completed her education, married, and spent her life advocating for children in isolated religious communities. In a rare interview in 1955, she said, "What my family did wasn't faith. It was fear dressed up as theology, and the children paid the price." 3 of the younger children were eventually adopted by families outside Kentucky. The others spent their lives in state care, never fully able to reintegrate into society. The psychological damage was too deep. The Dalton case became a turning point in Kentucky law. In 1909, the state legislature passed the Desecration of Human Remains Act, explicitly criminalizing the consumption, preservation for non-medical purposes, or ritualistic use of human corpses. The law also established mandatory reporting requirements for deaths occurring in isolated communities and expanded the state's authority to investigate religious groups suspected of abusive practices. The case also highlighted the danger of extreme religious isolation. Legal scholars argued that while individuals had a right to practice their faith, that right ended when it caused physical or psychological harm, especially to children. This principle would later influence rulings on child welfare in religious communities across the United States. Culturally, the case forced Appalachian communities to confront the limits of the mind-your-own-business code. Newspapers ran editorials urging residents to report suspicious practices, even when they involved family or neighbors. Some communities established volunteer welfare committees to monitor isolated families. But change came slowly. Rural isolation remained a reality, and practices hidden behind closed doors continued. The Dalton case wasn't a definitive solution. It was a warning that horror could thrive anywhere silence was valued above intervention. Years after the raid, Sheriff Thomas Brennan was asked whether he felt he'd done enough. His answer was both honest and haunted. "I heard Ruth's story, and I believed her. But there were 40 years before Ruth. 40 years of people seeing things, hearing things, knowing something was wrong and saying nothing. I wasn't the hero. Ruth was. She ran. And that run saved the children still alive." Brennan retired in 1920 and never spoke publicly about the case again. But those who knew him said he kept a photograph of the children rescued from the compound on his desk, a reminder of what happens when good people stay silent. The Dalton compound was seized by the state and burned to the ground in March 1908. The cellar was filled with concrete, and the land was marked as condemned. For decades, locals avoided the site, believing it was cursed. The jars of human remains were eventually buried in a mass grave in an unmarked location, with only state records documenting their existence. In 1985, a historian researching Appalachian religious movements attempted to locate the site of the Dalton compound. He found the concrete-filled cellar and the remnants of the foundation. In his published account, he wrote, "Standing there, you can almost hear the silence of 40 years, The silence of children who grew up believing horror was holiness. The Dalton family case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how theology, isolation, and family systems can converge to normalize the unthinkable. It revealed how easily extreme beliefs can be passed down through generations when those beliefs are never challenged by outside voices. The case forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. What happens when religious freedom becomes a shield for abuse? How do we balance respect for privacy with the duty to protect the vulnerable? And how do we intervene in closed communities without violating fundamental rights? The Dalton case didn't provide easy answers, but it provided a lesson that silence enables horror, that isolation protects predators, and that sometimes the only thing standing between atrocity and justice is a single voice willing to say, "This is wrong." Ruth Dalton was that voice, and because she ran, because she spoke, 12 children were saved from spending the rest of their lives in a compound where death was never an ending, only a transformation into the next meal. The family that ate their dead for 40 years is gone. But the warning remains. When we allow communities to exist beyond scrutiny, when we value privacy over protection, we create spaces where horror can thrive for generations. And somewhere, in sealed case files in Frankfort, Kentucky, there are photographs of 14 ceramic jars, each labeled with a name and a date. Silent witnesses to 40 years of faith twisted into something unrecognizable, and children who learned too late that not all communion is holy.